So after many years of reading articles from Reason Magazine online, I finally decided to get a subscription. It's not expensive. It was like $18 or something. My first issue finally came, and it's already worth it. It was definitely worth it. Awesome magazine. One article I want to talk about now is having to do with economic nationalism, and I've noticed that this is really picking up in popular culture. The nationalism is really taken off. I mean, it's been since Trump even started campaigning. You know, his campaign was largely centered around nationalist rhetoric. So it's no surprise then that he implements such things. And it's a bit surprising that people still buy into it, though. Part of the Trump administration's nationalist propaganda is heavily tied to demonizing China. The argument is dependence. I googled some where we're overly dependent, especially on China. This article by Eric Boehm, Boehm, he cites World Trade Organization statistics which show that China's really not that major of a player, especially when it comes to the medical supplies. I find it interesting that they're playing this game with China, and China, especially when it comes to medical supplies, are not a major issue here. But so let's see. First, this is from March 19th. Trump advisor Peter Navarro slams Big Pharma's lobbying against possible Buy America executive order. And I do believe that is, they wanted to make it a law that the government has to buy American. So it's not quite as extreme as saying private companies have to buy American, which would have been outright fascism and national. Obviously, I'd be less worried about this, even though the government shouldn't be doing anything like this to begin with. But says one of Donald Trump's leading trade advisors slammed Big Pharma's attempts to lobby against an executive order he is preparing to push companies to relocate medical supply chains to the United States. So, and how they're going to do that is my understanding was they were going to make it that the government had to buy medical supplies from United States manufacturers. The thing about that is that if it's more expensive to do that, it's the same problem of any other taxation program, is that this is like the article where the Air Force can't explain why it spent $1,000 for a coffee cup, and outrageous purchases like this. I mean, it just completely bloats and inflates the pricing of everything that they're purchasing, because they have like a guaranteed demand. Like, the prices, not only is it probably obviously better to buy these drugs elsewhere due to the price, or else they'd already be buying them in the United States, but also this law would make the prices go up of these drugs anyway now, because would be this demand increase. And so that's going to naturally, no doubt, affect the rest of the medical industry at the consumer end eventually. So, that's the whole problem with this government, this idea that government can somehow bring us to prosperity. The nationalists are no different really than the socialists in that sense. I mean, they even use a lot of socialist rhetoric. They always talk about this is going to benefit the American workers. These greedy capitalists are sending jobs overseas, putting workers out of jobs. So it's pretty much identical propaganda in that regard. Different implementation, though. The United States is not dependent on China specifically. In February, the FDA touched off a brief panic with a statement warning that the coronavirus outbreak in China could disrupt supply chains and lead to a shortage of drugs in America. The neo-nationalists pounced. In a February letter to the FDA, Hawley called America's supposed dependence on Chinese-made drugs inexcusable. Part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the $2.3 trillion aid bill passed by Congress and signed by Trump in March, calls for the Department of Health and Human Services to develop, quote, strategies to encourage domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. By May, the Trump administration had approved a $350 million grant for a little-known Virginia company that promised to make drugs in the United States. This is a great day for America, Navarro proclaimed at a press conference. America's global supply chains for pharmaceutical drugs are actually quite diverse and resilient. So down here in the infograph, which is based on World Trade Organization 2019, China accounts for 8% of medical supplies imported to the United States. Top five's Ireland at 17%, Germany at 12%, Switzerland at 9%, China at 8%, Mexico at 6%, 48% from all other sources. Meanwhile, China gets 19% of their medical supplies from the United States. So actually, the narrative is kind of reversed. Obviously, the 8% that comes from China would have been affected, potentially, by the coronavirus, of course. But is that, in the grand scheme of things, these are market fluctuations that would be happening anyway. So being, quote, 8% dependent on Chinese imports of medical supplies, it's interesting to me that they're picking on China in that regard when it's such a small percentage of the medical supplies that actually come into the United States from around the world. Meanwhile, China is importing 19% of their medical supplies from the United States. So, interesting propaganda. So let's see. It says there are roughly 2,000 manufacturing facilities around the world authorized by the FDA to produce active pharmaceutical ingredients for American consumers. Only 230 of those are in China. Some 510 are in the United States. 1,048 are in the rest of the world. So, but and they cite an interesting benefit of decentralization in this sense. They allow drug manufacturers to operate more nimbly and efficiently, which also offers an advantage when confronting natural disasters and other crises. Right? So if you have all of your production centralized in one area or from one source or chain, if something happens to that source or chain or in that area, your supply lines are obviously destroyed. So yet another benefit of global markets, which these nationalists, they just seem to want to destroy based on false propaganda. We are not dependent on China for medical supplies. The effect of that shortage of medical supplies of the 8% that China imports would have been negligible compared to probably the tariffs. Pick any tariff that it's much greater than China even imports. Meanwhile, an April report from the St. Louis Federal Reserve found that 70% of essential medical supplies consumed in the United States in 2018, including gloves, hand sanitizer, masks, and other key coronavirus fighting stuff, were produced in the United States. This is under the subtitle, The Fallacy of Chinese Dependence, and according to these World Trade statistics, that's true. We are not dependent on China. I'm sure we import a lot. It says here that the global medical trade is a $1 trillion a year industry. Top importers United States is actually the top importer by quite a margin in billions of United States dollars, 191. The second is Germany at 87 billion. China is third at 65. But we are also one of the top exporters at 117 billion. Germany exports 136 billion. They're first. So, global trade is intricate and expansive. I Pencil by Leonard is a great article about this, about how much goes in to producing a pencil. The thesis is not one person knows how to make me, and it's a pretty compelling argument. Maybe one person knows in theory, but does he know how to make, the eraser? Does he know how to make the lacquer? Does he know how to make absolutely everything? No, probably not. So definitely, if you're not familiar with that, check that out. So the name of this article is Trump's Trade War Made the Pandemic Worse and Nationalism Will Slow the Recovery. But I just wanted to get into some of those facts about the narrative put out there by the administration and on the supportive media. Since 2018, Trump has imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, solar panels, and washing machines. Other tariffs have been aimed at roughly $300 billion in annual imports from China, covering everything from industrial equipment to children's toys. Altogether, those tariffs have sucked an estimated $80 billion out of the United States economy, according to an estimate from the Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan tax policy think tank. That's the cost of the trade war there on the United States, imposed by its own government. At the time, the administration was weighing whether to include products like hand sanitizer, thermometers, oxygen concentrators, surgical gloves, and other types of medical grade protective gear in the list of Chinese made items to be subjected to new tariffs. Matt Rowan, president of the Health Industry Distributors Association, emphasized that such supplies were, quote, essential to protecting healthcare providers and their patients and would remain a critical component of our nation's response to public health emergencies. The most instantly noticeable effect of Trump's tariffs was to increase the price of goods imported from China, including medical equipment. Importers would have no choice but to almost immediately pass along those price increases to hospitals, surgery centers, long-term care facilities, individual consumers, and government programs who purchase our products. Laura Simmons, the president of Medline Industries, is quoted as saying during a June 2019 hearing on the tariffs. So they were talking about this before this even really broke out. They were talking about this, about tariffs on medical equipment back in June 2019. But the Trump administration went ahead with the tariffs anyway. Imports of medical equipment from China fell after the tariffs were imposed, as would be expected, and imports from other parts of the world did not increase enough to make up the difference. So it's likely that hospitals and other healthcare providers were drawing down on existing inventories and hoping the trade war would end before they had to restock. Trump finally lifted tariffs on medical equipment after the pandemic struck. Unfortunately, the administration did nothing to remove tariffs on chemicals used to manufacture disinfectants and antiseptics, items that will be in even higher demand as the economy reopens. Here's the cost of the trade war that the United States is inflicting essentially on its own people without realizing it, or perhaps they do realize it and that's why they're doing it. This is the problem of nationalism that has been illustrated through history, I would say, and has been more or less thoroughly debunked, even right here in this great article from Reason. It's amazing to me. But I want to bring something else up here that I say, this thing I saw on Facebook. It's just something someone sharing that's pro-Trump. Oh, look at all the things Trump did, and it's got this long, seemingly impressive list of accomplishments. Some are worse than others, I suppose. But I want to... I saw something in here that blew my mind, honestly, that Trump had tried to create an import deal with Canada to bring more Canadian drugs into the United States to lower the price. So it's incredible to me that these politicians can basically go up there and implement policies which destroy their propaganda, or at least show their propaganda to be bogus, because he even seems to notice that imports are good for the consumers. Oh, well, we're not producing here, so now we need to import. His way to try and fix that, unfortunately, is nationalism, more or less. It's a soft nationalism so far, I guess. It's sort of a lazy nationalism so far. It hasn't gotten so extreme, but it's extreme enough by my view. It's gone well past the point of acceptable anyway, or anything that I would want to hear. But it's usually Trump plan would allow states to import drugs from Canada. This is from Politico, and I've got one just from Reuters. I suppose I'll read the Reuters. The Reuters one is actually the Canadian people said no, we don't want to import drugs. The administration proposed new regulations that would allow states to import prescription drugs from Canada. They would require a state such as Florida to partner with a wholesaler licensed by Health Canada, which regulates drugs. So it's just crazy to me. It's mind-blowing to me that he can make these types of proposals knowing that this would benefit the consumer, but then he wants to shut off other things. So you would think that he would intuitively understand the economic implications of him imposing tariffs on other goods. I mean, these people are literally playing with the lives of the population here, right? Meddling in the pricing and the import and export and the dealing of medical supplies. So you can see here how if we need drugs, we need to import drugs. If drugs are in short supply, why would you even put tariffs on goods from a country in general if we're importing medical supplies from them, even though we don't import much from China, and I don't know what the imports on the or the tariffs on the Irish imports are, but if it's just all across the board or whatever. But it just goes to show that, either the guy is schizophrenic, insane the way most statists are, they don't realize they're contradicting themselves, or he absolutely knows that he's manipulating the economy and people's lives are at stake. He thinks he's like doing a good job here, and honestly, what he did is he did a great job of showing why his whole philosophy is bunk. That the government should not be trying to pick and choose winners in the market, should not be messing with the flow of goods. And then the Canadians said that they don't even want to import. So, they said their priority was making sure that Canadians have drugs. And it's funny to me because they're like using nationalist rhetoric too, but if the money was there, I'm sure they'd sell. They just don't necessarily have an incentive to sell. They don't have a surplus to sell drugs to the United States. They're focusing on the consumers, or I'm not sure if it works through the government or whatever, but if that's a true consumer. But they don't have drugs to sell the United States. Basically, they're not interested. Hopefully it didn't like solidify in his mind that nationalism is good, which it probably did. He's like, see, they're taking care of their people. We need to take care of our people. It's incredible to me that I found out that he proposed this importing deal, because it goes to show that people need drugs, so we need to import them. Well, how about everybody just lets the market work? That would be great if they would stop meddling in the economy to begin with. This is not fundamentally different than what these Democrats are doing. You cost $80 billion, it said, due to this, imposed on the Americans themselves, and you're raising prices, and you yourself limited the amount of medical supplies that came in through China. The Trump administration themselves limited through their tariffs before the pandemic. In June 19, they were talking about this. Limited that flow, even though it was only 8% of imports from China anyway, but they themselves limited that flow through tariffs, and then lifted them after the pandemic hit because they could see. So, this should just go to show anybody's support. These people are playing with people's lives like we're just pawns. Like global trade is something that they have the right to manipulate, allegedly for our benefit, but mostly at our expense, pretty much entirely at our expense, and at the cost of our lives at times. Yeah, so those are the evils of nationalism here. Everybody who's likes to start advocating economic nationalism, like in the article, he calls them neo-nationalists. But yeah, these are the evils of nationalism. Trump, this is not any different. Authoritarianism is authoritarianism. Who they say they're benefiting. Government is not going to bring us prosperity, no matter how you try to slice it. I want to end with an excerpt from an article that appeared in the Chicago Tribune, May 3rd, 2019, by Jonah Goldberg, entitled "Economic Nationalism is Just Socialism on the Right." Historically, the primary conservative argument against top-down planning wasn't so much that politicians and bureaucrats aren't smart enough to run the economy from some Washington-based control room, but that it simply can't be done. Policymakers suffer from what Hayek called the knowledge problem. The market is too complex, with too many variables on the ground for anyone to manage things from above. On some parts of the right, the argument is changing. The new proponents of, quote, economic nationalism no longer think elites can't run the economy, just that liberal elites or globalists can't run it. Part of this stems from the often paranoid conviction that liberal elites have brilliantly rigged the system in their favor. So, the thinking goes, if they can pull that off, so can we. It doesn't work that way. Such thinking is wrong regardless of the partisan agenda behind it, which is why Hayek dedicated his book The Road to Serfdom to the socialists of all parties.